name is Richard Piccarreto. I'm with the Thoreau Society in Concord. And I want to thank Dave for the technical support, Marie for helping me get here tonight. This is a continuing series of public events made possible by a grant from Mass Humanities, actually, and the Mass Cultural Council. We're grateful for that. I'm also going to be using images tonight from the Concord Free Public Library, and I always like to acknowledge their special collections department as well. Great spot, great resource. The Thoreau Society, we currently have about 1,200 members in all 50 states and in 30 nations around the world, including the Penobscot Nation. We are the oldest organization, oldest American organization dedicated to an author. We go back to 1941, actually. And the Thoreau Society exists to stimulate interest in and foster education about Henry's life, works, legacy, and his place in his world and in ours, challenging all of us to live a deliberate, considered life. I'm here to talk about the particular theme of this, which is one of three current public presentations we're giving, about Henry's reputation and a little bit about his biography to kind of counter the narrative that has sort of slid Henry into this kind of meme that he was really not doing what he was telling us he was going to do, and that he was kind of a hypocrite, and that he went home to get his laundry done, and he didn't really stay out at Walden Pond, this kind of thing. There's a lot of takedowns of Henry that have happened in his time, a bit after his death, and then all the way until even the 20-teens. We're going to see there's just a lot of people who sort of read into Henry's experiment and kind of put their own projection as to what Henry was supposed to be doing and how he was supposed to be doing it. And so I'm here to sort of defend Henry. He's enigmatic. He's hard to figure out. So yeah, I think it's easy for people to read into, put into their own sort of expectation what Henry was supposed to be doing or not doing. I'm going to start by talking first about Nathaniel Hawthorne meeting Henry Thoreau in September of 1842 at the Old Manse. He's invited Henry Thoreau over for dinner. Mr. Thoreau dined with us yesterday. He is a singular character, a young man with much of wild original nature still remaining in him. And so far as he is sophisticated, it is in a way and a method of his own. He is ugly as sin, long-nosed, queer-mouthed, and with uncouth and rustic though courteous manners corresponding very well with such an exterior. But his ugliness is of an honest and agreeable fashion, and becomes him much better than beauty. He was educated, I believe, at Cambridge, and formerly kept school in this town. But for 2 or 3 years back, he has repudiated all regular modes of getting a living, and seems inclined to lead a sort of Indian life among civilized men. In Indian life, I mean as respects the absence of any systematic effort for a livelihood. He has been for some time an inmate of Mr. Emerson's family, and in requital he labors in the garden and performs such other offices as may suit him, being entertained by Mr. Emerson for the sake of what true manhood there is in him. Mr. Thoreau is a keen and delicate observer of nature, a genuine observer, which I suspect is almost as rare a character as even an original poet. And nature, in return for his love, seems to adopt him as her special child and shows him secrets which few others are allowed to witness. He is familiar with beast, fish, fowl, and reptile, and has strange stories to tell of adventures and friendly passages with these lower brothers of mortality. Herb and flower, likewise, wherever they grow, whether in garden or in wildwood, are his familiar friends. He is also on intimate terms with the clouds and can tell the portents of storms. It is a characteristic trait that he has a great regard for the memory of the Indian tribes, whose wild life would have suited him so well. And strange to say, he seldom walks over a plowed field without picking up an arrowhead, a spearhead, or some other relic of the red man, and their spirits, as if their spirits willed him to be the inheritor of their simple wealth. So even the takedowns start during Henry's life. That's kind of a little bit damning with faint praise, I think, for Henry there. And Henry's of this mind of, if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it's because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. How many of you have read some Henry Thoreau? And any time recently or back in school days, right? So yeah, we have this kind of iconic thing about Henry, and he's been poked at a bit over time for sure. When we think about Henry, there's a lot of sort of quick one-offs that come to mind. He's eccentric. I'll give you that. Yes, Henry is definitely eccentric, especially for his time. Um, he's a loner. I'm going to counter that. He did not go to Walden Pond to be alone. He's going to Walden Pond, and it's filled with other people living around Walden Pond. There are formerly enslaved people. There are Irish railroad workers, and when he builds the roof for his small house at Walden, it is a group effort with a number of friends from town, this kind of thing. He's going to have a meeting of the Female Anti-Slavery Society at his cabin, which will total 30 or 40 people, all standing around his cabin eating berries and melons and this kind of thing. So he's not trying to escape people per se. He's a Luddite, meaning he eschews technology. He wants everything to go back to just the absolute simplest forms, and is a non-technologist. This isn't true either. He is going to be working in his family business, a pencil factory, and he's actually going to be an innovative pencil maker. He's going to be helping his father process that. I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit further down the road. He's a pacifist. For the most part, Henry will be along the lines of remaining at arm's length, but he's going to move from ideas of civil disobedience, which don't necessarily equal pacifism, to supporting John Brown prior to the American Civil War, and John Brown's move to want to arm enslaved individuals to actually take their freedom back through violence. He's a contrarian, yes, absolutely. Henry loves to take the opposite pole of some particular argument and do his best to make you have to stand on your 2 feet and argue your side. And he's a hypocrite. He didn't really do what he set out to do, and he made all these shortcuts and was contrary to what his overall project was. And this is really sort of the gist of what I want to talk about tonight. So I was mentioning he's enigmatic. He's hard to pin down. And even with his 2 million word journal that we now have, along with his published works, there is plenty to talk about with Henry. In our Thoreau Society, there's just endless conversations about different angles and different quotes and different moods that Henry is in. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit about where Henry came from. Virginia Road in Concord. This is the building that we work out of. This is Thoreau Farm in Concord, Massachusetts. This is the house that Henry was born in. He only lived here for 8 months. And actually, this house existed up the road about 1,000 yards before it was moved down here in 1878. But Thoreau Farm Trust, Gaining Ground Organic Garden, which is organic farm for local food banks, is on this property. And we're upstairs in this building as well. The reason this is red here on one side and white on the other is to be historically correct for the time. For a good amount of time in the 19th century, white paint was expensive compared to red paint, and you would have white on the whole front parts of the house that could be seen from the road, and you didn't bother painting white all the way in the back where nobody could see it unless they were deep on your property. So this is actually kind of true to form here. So the picture of this is what it looks like from the road. Nice and bright. Henry's born July 12th, 1817, but he has a sister, Helen, who's 5 years older than he is. He's got a brother, John, who's 3 years older than he is. And he's got a sister 2 years younger than he is, Sophia. Sophia we have to thank particularly for the literary executor work that she does for her brother's work after his death at 44 years old in 1862. When Henry was born, he was nicknamed the Judge. He was a serious and stern child, He was in utero during the year that had no summer, 1816 into 1817. This is when a volcano on the other side of the planet actually blackened the skies, and there were freezes in July, and all. It was just a really tough year. Crops were wiped out, and it was a very eerie and tough time. So he's born. He is very quiet and observant, and seems humorless, but I'm going to also argue that Henry had quite a sense of humor. It's a little bit wry and sarcastic, but he is definitely has his own sense of humor. We have three of the best images, I would say the three best images of Henry. An 1854 crayon drawing of him. We have the classic 1856 Worcester daguerreotype that most people are familiar with. And we have an 1861 photograph from New Bedford. And Henry is only about 8 months from death here due to tuberculosis. And you can see he's starting to age pretty quickly there. Henry's father, John, was at first a shopkeeper in Concord, briefly a farmer at Thoreau Farm, but his brother-in-law, Charles Dunbar, is going to come into a line of what's called plumbago up in New Hampshire and actually get the rights to mine this and bring this down. It's a graphite type material that they're going to bring down from New Hampshire. And John Thoreau's going to go into the pencil business with his brother-in-law. And the Thoreau pencils lead to the four types of pencil, the number 1, 2, 3, and 4, flat pencils for carpenters that are not rolling on boards, this kind of thing. And Henry will be working in and out over the years with his father in that business. From being definitely working class, farm and shopkeeper level in terms of socioeconomic levels, the pencil business will bring the Thoreaus solidly up into the middle class, and now even arguing to the upper middle class by the time Henry is sick and dying in 1862. They'll eventually only be grinding plumbago to sell to printers to use in printing operations rather than the pencils. But here's an image of one of the Thoreau pencils from the day. Henry will invent a little column of air to blow the ground plumbago to separate the finest particles from the heavier so that they can really isolate those and keep grinding and grinding to get to this very, very fine powder with the plumbago. They'll mix that with clay, and then they'll cap these pencils with cedar that they're getting from down south. Now, in the 1830s, William Lloyd Garrison, a typesetter in Boston, is an early abolitionist activist who's going to put together the Liberator newspaper. This is going to come out every Friday. And William Lloyd Garrison is of the mind that we can end slavery by guilting Americans into a deep enough guilt that they'll actually stop enslavement. He calls this moral suasion. So he's got an anti-violent approach to the end of slavery, and he will be publishing on the front page of his Liberator newspaper each Friday these just horrendous, egregious stories from around the country as torture and killing of enslaved individuals and things from the Middle Passage and just heart-wrenching stories. One of the things that a lot of us up here aren't quite clear on is that William Lloyd Garrison and the Garrisonians, as they'll be known, this group of people who are following this very closely and are subscribers, one of the masthead taglines here is "No union with slaveholders." So this is the 1830s, and we've got people here in the Northeast who are saying, we don't want to be a part of the union with the South. So this is 30 years before the Civil War, and you have people saying, we'd like to secede from the South due to slavery. So this is interesting, and this is something that really got my attention when I was looking at this. But this is going to be a newspaper that the Thoreaus get in their house. And so Henry's mother and his sisters, Henry's mother, by the way, runs their house like a boarding house. So they always have extra boarders there. She's making money on the side with the boarders. There's a lot of comings and goings going on at the Thoreau houses, numerous houses in Concord over the years that they live in. And the Liberator comes every Friday, and his sisters, his aunts, and his mother are devout readers of this. They are very much politically astute and aware. I would not use the word active because women can't vote at this point. So they are going to soon be a part by 1837 of the Female Anti-Slavery Society in Concord, which has a number of prominent women. A Black woman, Susan Garrison, is a part of this. And as far as they can go, they will have bake sales, this kind of thing, and ask for public speakers to come into town and talk about abolition. This is very controversial at that time. First of all, the women are considered to be this kind of marginalized, it's a lovely, cute thing. The ladies in town have their anti-slavery society, they have their bake sales, this kind of thing. But no one is quite they're not taken quite as seriously as they will be about 10 years later in the 1840s, when they'll really be the central fire under Concord being an underground railroad town, and the activism that Concord starts to undertake in terms of, and even Ralph Waldo Emerson at this time in the 1830s in his journal, he writes that the abolitionists are these shrill, competing voices that can't get enough of hearing themselves, and that Emerson writes, "You cease to be a man that you be an abolitionist." Emerson will go 180 degrees by 1840s and actually say that the cause of abolition will make a man. And so he'll go 180 degrees and actually start to really become active himself. But at this point, they're considered very marginalized. And this is the environment that Henry grows up in. And so Henry has kind of this unequivocal, unwavering sort of principle that Henry sort of brings to life. And of course, it's going to get him into a lot of trouble because he's going to be stubbornly assertive exactly as to how he wants to live and how he wants to be. He's going to go to Harvard, 1833 to 37. And when he comes out of Harvard, he is going to pass on getting his graduation diploma. He is going to say that it cost $5 at that time, but he is going to say that let every sheep keep its own skin, he says, because they would actually print it on sheepskin. And so basically the equivalent of about $150 in today's money. Henry graduates from Harvard and does not have a diploma to show for it. He will be asked to speak at his graduation, and this is the year of 1837, when this is the first major financial crisis in young America's history. The first major closing of 40% of the banks in young America, a very contentious period of unemployment from 1837 to about 1844. And when Henry decides to speak for his graduation ceremony, he chooses the topic, the commercial spirit of modern times, which is apropos, and it's right on the money for exactly what is happening while this is going on. Before a group of hundreds of people at Harvard, Henry asserts that commerce destroys moral freedom, but freedom must come first because freedom generates commerce, not the other way around. But Henry is very wary of this material culture that's really starting to thrive in this kind of post-agrarian, early industrial America of the 1840s. As Laura Dasso-Walls, who is a former professor from Notre Dame, wrote in her 2017 Thoreau Life, this is a great biography of Henry. If you're interested, it's pretty much the latest and greatest, complete, very easy to read and really well-researched biography of Henry. A lot of incredible insight by Laura Walls. She writes that Henry noted that, quote, "By tying us to material goods, commerce does not free us, but enslaves us, turns us into brutes. To be human is to cast off these material desires and walk forth freely into paradise." Right there, Henry laid the foundations for Walden, unquote, is her take on Henry's speech for his college graduation. Walls also goes on to remind us of what Henry's idea of the ideal work week is. Now, Henry kind of snarkily says, hey, just because God took 6 days to make the creation and took off on Sunday doesn't mean we have to work from sunup to sundown 6 days a week. Henry advocates for working hard enough 1 day a week and then having 6 days off to enjoy the rest of God's creation. He writes, The seventh day should be man's day of toil, wherein to earn his living by the sweat of his brow, and the other six, his Sabbath of the affections and the soul, in which to range this widespread garden and drink in the soft influences and sublime revelations of nature. So there's Henry proposing his one-day work week, where we have enough time, you've put in enough effort, you've got enough resources to make it through 6 days before you have to work again. After graduating in this chaotic time in 1837, Henry gets his first experience hanging out in a cabin with one of his fellow classmates, Charles Stearns Wheeler. They're going to spend some well-earned downtime at this point in that first summer of graduation at, this is going to be on Flint's Pond, the pond over from where, also known as Sandy Pond, where just up the road from where Walden is. So it's a little bit of foreshadowing for Henry, is that he's here in this cabin on the pond at that point. And Henry, for all the tumult going on in 1837, Henry gets a pretty plum position as a teacher in Concord. He's hired right out of Harvard. He's going to get paid $500 a year to teach 90 students of various ages. And he's going to be teaching on the ground floor of the Masonic Temple that is still in town today. This is actually an 1820 building, but the actual Masons Hall here was founded by Paul Revere, actually, in Concord, who came out from Boston, founded in 1797. And on the first floor of this building, Henry is getting to work teaching these children. And a couple of weeks in, the local administrator comes in and says, "Henry, you're doing a fine job, but I'm noting that you're not hitting the children. I haven't seen you hit any of the children yet." And Henry says, "I don't need to hit the children. I can discipline them, in my own way." "Oh, no, Henry. The ferule, this stick to hit children on the hand, is absolutely critical for early childhood education, and you need to be using the ferule. In fact, I need you to pull 2 children right now and demonstrate for me how the ferule is used." And Henry has to take a boy and a girl who've done absolutely nothing wrong, smack them on the hands, they're both crying. Henry hands the keys to him and says, "I quit, I'm done, I'm not doing this." Unequivocal, principled. I'm sure his parents were thrilled. He's just graduated from Harvard. They lived with their aunts, so they could afford to keep Henry at Harvard. And 2 weeks into his teaching career, Henry's going back to making pencils with his father at the pencil factory, but demonstrating this unwavering commitment to his own principle. Back at his house, where there are people boarding, a family is there that happens to be Ralph Waldo Emerson's sister-in-law, Lucy Jackson, and her husband has left them high and dry. And Lucy Jackson is very taken with Henry and brings her over to her brother-in-law's house to meet Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Emerson's immediately struck by the spirited intellect of his new friend and his wry observations, and asks him straight out on the first day he's met him, "What are you doing? Do you keep a journal?" And Henry starts his journal that day. That is where that comes together. And that'll become a 2 million word journal by the time of Henry's death in 1862. Emerson noted in his journal, quote, "My good Henry Thoreau made else this solitary afternoon sunny with his simplicity and clear perception. Everything that boy says makes merry with society, though nothing can be graver than his meaning." Emerson told more than one visitor to Concord that Thoreau was the man of Concord. We could not do without him. He has been writing his journal, "Where is our American poet? Where's our American voice?" And I think Emerson first looks at Henry Thoreau as answering this. Later, I think he'll look toward Walt Whitman as being that American poet that Emerson's been waiting for. Now, Henry Thoreau has already read Ralph Waldo's first published piece, Nature, while he was at Harvard. It came out in 1836, and we know from the Harvard Library that Henry had it out twice from the library. Nature is the cornerstone text to American transcendentalist thought. Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1835, is in a very dynamic transitional place in his life. He's lost his young first wife to tuberculosis. He has left the church. He's the 7th generation American minister who actually leaves the church and is very taken by all world religion, from Confucius and the Vedas of India and Islamic philosophies and the Quakers and Sufi mystics and all this kind of anything that is religious philosophy. Emerson is loves getting a hold of translations and this kind of thing. But he's also fascinated by some of the writing coming from Europe. He's reading Goethe and Kant coming from Germany. These are the German transcendentalists at the time. This is going to be translated by Carlyle, England. And this is where science is starting to take bites out of the traditional historic religious texts and say, look, physics is working this way because physics is really coming up. Our understanding of science is starting to challenge religion pretty solidly. And Emerson's fascinated by all this. When he leaves the church, he spends a little time in Europe going to visit some writers that he would like to meet, Carlyle and Wordsworth and others. And he finds himself at the Paris Plant Museum in 1833, and he sees an exhibit of plants that's effectively showing evolution by a French taxonomist. We're not calling it evolution yet, but Emerson has this kind of mini epiphany while he's there looking at this, that there is this singular, holistic aspect to everything. And what I mean by everything is God, man, nature, science, you name it, is all one ball of everything. God's not out there someplace and this is the creation or nature. God is the creation. God is nature. We're all a part of the creation. That means God is a part of us. So God's not separate from us. And Emerson starts focusing on this, this kind of singularity and this kind of non-dualism that he's gotten from Eastern texts and others. And he's very inspired by this. And he weaves this into the book Nature. And this book Nature effectively pushes organized religion off the table. He's a Harvard divinity graduate, a seventh generation American minister, all of his fathers and grandfathers. He is stepping out and saying that we have a direct relationship with God based through nature, and that it's our responsibility to refine ourselves, effectively to redeem ourselves, and that there's no church, savior, or ceremonies or songs that are part of this, that that's all superfluous, that we have a direct relationship with God, that we are responsible to refine ourselves and move toward divinity with God by shifting gears, this kind of thing. This is hugely controversial for a former minister to be writing. Blasphemy, but also quite inspiring to a number of young, open-minded writers, Melville, Whitman, Emily Dickinson, the 19th century writers that are huge fans of Thoreau. Walt Whitman, our great American poet, said that I was simmering, simmering, simmering. Emerson brought me to a boil. So this is going to influence lots of people. Emerson's going to inherit some money from his first wife and buy his house on the other side of Concord from the Old Manses, where he actually wrote this book. He was there temporarily. And as he's raising his family with his second wife there, his house becomes this salon of all these seekers and philosophers and poets and students. And it's Hotel Emerson. His second wife, Lydia, has to deal with who's staying for tea, who's staying for dinner, who's sleeping over, who's sleeping on the couch. Every half hour, someone's knocking on the door. They want to talk to Emerson. People are coming from as far away as Virginia. I've got to meet the guy that wrote this book, and I need to speak with him further. And so this is bringing lots of people to Concord, and Emerson is kind of the sun in the middle of the solar system there, with all these people buzzing around him. Henry Thoreau will be invited to live upstairs. Waldo Emerson is spending his mornings reading and writing. He eats midday and then he goes for his amble in the afternoon. And that is where Emerson feels he's connecting directly with God. He's out in nature and he'll walk many miles, rain or shine, each day. Emerson tells us about a specific revelation he feels from nature, which is parallel to what Japanese Buddhists will call satori. And satori is a moment of kind of losing yourself and finding and feeling fully connected all at once. You kind of have this remarkable, momentary, life-changing sensibility that kind of hits you. And nothing in particular is going to set that off. It just happens in a particular time. And Emerson tells us that he was walking across a snowy, slushy common with gray skies, late afternoon, nothing in particular in his head of any importance. His head bathed in the blithe air leading up to infinity. And all of a sudden he felt that all mean egotism vanished from him, and that he was nothing, but he could see all, that he felt part and particle of God, and he describes himself as a transparent eyeball in that moment. This is his description of how he felt in that moment. This is one of those life-changing moments that Emerson weaves into why he believes our direct connection to God is through nature, and that is where we find our path to divinity, each one of us individually. So this will become, as I said, the cornerstone text for American transcendentalist thought. And this is a big word that a lot of people ask, what does that mean in particular? Kant and Goethe and some of the German philosophers are known as transcendentalists. Actually, transcendentalism is a somewhat of a derogatory term used here in the States, as meaning we don't know what the heck they're talking about. They're just such lofty philosophers, and they're up there in some level that we can't reach. We don't know what they're talking about. They've transcended even our understanding. This is sort of a derogatory thing. Emerson will say later, when asked what is transcendental, he'll say it's idealism. There's an idealism that's at the center of this. Transcendentalism, this is grabbed from a dictionary somewhere, maybe melded from a couple definitions. 19th century movement of writers and philosophers in New England who were loosely bound together by adherence to an idealistic system of thought based on a belief in the essential unity of all creation, that oneness I was telling you about. The innate goodness of humanity, no original sin. The Germans move off of that and say, no, we're born perfectly good. We can be pulled off course, certainly during our lives, but we're not born sinful. Theologians have been arguing about that for 1,000 years. And the supremacy of insight over logic and experience for the revelation of the deepest truths. Henry Thoreau talks about building castles in the air and then putting foundations under them. German transcendentalism, especially as it was refracted by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas Carlyle, Platonism, Neoplatonism, and the Indian and Chinese scriptures all play a part in this. They were a source to which the New England transcendentalists turned in their search for a liberating philosophy. So again, this is the dualistic Western religion, God, the devil, good, evil, these kinds of things, gets melded and woven in with the Asian and Eastern non-dualism. And this is kind of East meets West. A lot of people say that American transcendentalism and Emerson was sort of our first American philosophy, but it's not American philosophy. It's from all over the world, just like America is. We are from all over the world. We're the melting pot country. This philosophy is a melting pot of all of these different philosophies. This is Ralph Waldo Emerson's house. It still stands today. You can visit this as a museum home. I just kind of covered that. Let's see. All right. As I said, Emerson's going to invite Henry to live at the house. There's a great quote from Emerson in his journals, which he journals every day. He also has millions of words and an extensive encyclopedic-sized group of his own journals. And Ralph Waldo Emerson is not a handyman. He's a thoughts guy. He's a former minister, and so he's got Henry Thoreau there doing the laboring on the property and taking care of the gardens and fixing the fences and things. Waldo Emerson writes in his journal, he says, when I show people my garden, usually they say something like, well, surely you have another garden. So it goes to show, as much as Waldo tries, it's going to be Henry who's going to be sort of the handyman at the house. And Henry has a few stints of different time lengths at the house, and they're extended. We're going to have a 25-year-old dynamic powerhouse, young woman, intellectual, Margaret Fuller, who will show up. She is an early feminist, and she knocks on Emerson's door. She's 25 years old. She bedazzles Ralph Waldo with her classic education and her ability. She's the first woman who's been allowed into the Harvard Library, and Emerson will invite her to edit the Dial magazine that he's working on with some of his friends. And oh, by the way, Margaret, if you need a place to crash, you can sleep on the couch in the living room. Well, she'll take Ralph Waldo up on that and be sleeping in that house for 4, 5, 6 weeks at a time. She becomes a part of the household. She's kind of Aunt Ellen to the children. And so this house, Emerson brings his dining room table out into the grass, into the warm weather, because that's the holy place to be eating. They're not supposed to be in this smoky, choky dining room in the back of the house. He wants to be outdoors. And when people go by here on the road, they're seeing these eccentrics having these dinners at Emerson's, and people are going, what is going on over here? There's just all this going on here. This is quite the salon of people in the 1840s. Emerson is thrilled with Henry. He writes, there came Henry with music book under his arm to press flowers in, with telescope in his pocket to see the birds, and microscope to count stamens, with a diary, a jackknife, and twine, in stout shoes and in strong gray trousers, ready to brave the shrub oaks and the smilax, and to climb the tree for a hawk's nest. His strong legs, when he wades, were no insignificant part of his armor. That is some praise from Emerson. But we'll have a very similar group of words. There comes again. This line starts, and this is the publisher and writer James Russell Lowell, who will criticize Henry because it's quite apparent Henry is seeing Ralph Waldo Emerson as his mentor, and he's got access to his library. He's living out of his house, and Henry starts to walk and talk like Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's 20 years old. He's very impressionable, like we all are at 20 years old. And James Russell Lowell will say, there comes Thoreau, for instance, to see him's rare sport, tread in Emerson's tracks with legs painfully short. How he jumps, how he strains and gets red in the face to keep step with the mystagogue's natural pace. He follows as close as a stick to a rocket, his fingers exploring the prophet's each pocket. Fie, for shame, brother bard, with good fruit of your own, can't you let neighbor Emerson's orchards alone? So this is him taking a few pokes at Henry in sort of Henry's transformation here. It would take some time for Henry to grow out from under all of these influences. Henry's also influenced by a man named George Minot, who is a very singular and sort of removed person from town, who lives up on the hill above Emerson. He lives with his sister. He never marries. And he is an avid hunter and farmer. And he's been incredibly, totally self-dependent, independent from joining any church in town, being politically active, socializing. He doesn't go to Boston. He's just this kind of one-off farmer. And Henry loves to go sit talk with him. And he's the old timer who tells the old stories of what Concord was like 80 years ago and this kind of thing, including that the last deer that was seen in town was at his mother's property 80 years prior. That's how long since they had seen a deer in Concord, this kind of thing. And he is also a huge influence on Henry. We're going to see Henry become this kind of very insular and sort of self-removed person for the most part, and very independent as he grows on. Minot is perhaps the most poetical farmer I know, who realizes to me the poetry of the farm's life. He does nothing with haste and drudgery, but as if he loved it. He makes the most of his labor and takes infinite satisfaction in every part of it. He's not looking forward to the sale of his crops or any pecuniary profit, but he is paid by the constant satisfaction which his labor yields him. He has not too much land to trouble him or too much work to do, no hired man or boy, but simply to amuse himself and live. He cares not so much to raise a large crop as to do his work well. And there's a painting from the late 19th century by a guy named Enoch Wood. And this is really supposed to be Lincoln talking with Washington in kind of an overarching kind of American theme. But when I saw this painting, I thought to myself, oh, this is exactly how I see this happening up at Minot's house. Minot would have chickens walking around him and his cats. He loved his cats. And there's a great quote. Minot tells Henry, Henry didn't smoke a pipe, but I think this is a pretty great representation of kind of what's going on up at Minot's house. He says to Henry at one point, I wouldn't kill a cat for $50. Now this guy had killed everything. Everything he saw, he was an avid hunter for decades. And Henry said, I wouldn't kill a cat for $100. And they go back and forth, I wouldn't kill a cat for, they love cats. And so they're like, I wouldn't kill a cat for $200, back and forth, and so on. So Henry, old man Minot is suffering from rheumatism, so he moves real slow. He's just kind of watching the birds and what's blooming and this kind of thing. And he constantly talks with Henry about keeping his eye on nature, and they know the day of the month that they're talking about. Oh, okay, that just bloomed, and we must be within 4 days of this or 4 days of that. And they're incredibly astute and tuned into nature around them. Minot's sister Mary is a clothing maker that he lives with, and Henry asks Mary to make him customized clothes for his hikes around, with different pockets and things, and the right kind of collar that he might need at the right time, this kind of thing. And the design he gives to Mary to make this custom clothing for him, she replies immediately to him, Henry, they don't wear it this way anymore. And Henry is beside himself. He writes about this in Walden. Who is they? I've just asked you to make this coat with these specifications. Henry, they don't wear it this way anymore. He finally turns around and goes, they do now. So he writes, and he gets quite upset about this whole fashion thing, about like people are chasing fashion around. He wants very practical clothing, heavy duty gray slacks so he can go through prickers and things like this and be out and wandering around. So these are the people that are definitely influencing Henry to become the kind of sort of solo operator that he's going to mostly become. All right, so we got through this, and where are we going to go here? We're at the we're at 1839 right now, and Henry and his brother John, they build a boat that's much like this small boat here, and they'll end up sailing it up the Concord and Merrimack to New Hampshire over a couple-week trip, and then come back down. Henry takes copious notes on this trip, and when he is spending his time a few years later at Walden Pond, this is what he's working on, is this book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack River, with his brother. There's a lot of philosophy and a lot of tangents in this book. It's not just them going up the river. It's actually a really interesting book, and this will be published in 1849, 10 years after he actually completes this trip with his brother. 1839 is also the year that Henry and his brother have started their own school in Concord. And in the summertime, they're going to get paid a visit by some family friends whose young son and daughter are Edmund Sewell and his sister Ellen, who I'm going to show you in a minute. Edmund shows up, and he's not only a part of the school, but he's kind of Henry's companion throughout the summer. Henry is showing him all kinds of natural phenomena and this kind of thing, taking him around town. And they're hiking and fishing and boating and shooting and swimming and doing all the things that a young teen is doing. And what's fascinating, and this is a part of the enigmatic part of Henry, is that Henry never marries. We have no idea what Henry's sexuality was, and he never expressed it. We have little clues, and it's taken a long time for people to start to lean toward the very possibility that Henry is dealing with repressing homosexual feelings. And the founder of the Thoreau Society, Walter Harding, brought this up in a deep analysis of Henry's work in the early 80s, and he was catcalled off the stage he was on. This flipped everybody out. Now, we have a lot of Thoreauvians that say Henry was just so brainy and just so to himself that he had no time for sexuality. It's like, well, I don't buy that, right? I don't care who you are, especially in your 20s and 30s. There's some kind of sexuality going on in one sort or another. It's just natural to all of us. And so there's this back and forth, and it's very much a mystery, and there's more and more experts on Henry that kind of lean toward, yeah, we're seeing the fact that he more than likely, Henry writes things that he was ashamed of his body, which is kind of interesting because Henry loves the reproductive qualities of all things in nature and how things can continually, reproduce and go on. And so it's really interesting because he's not a super fundamentalist religious person that has that kind of a guilt about it. There's some things going on there that remain a mystery, of course, that we go on about in back and forths on Henry. And Henry finds himself absolutely taken with young Edmund Sewell. He's a young teen, and he writes this poem that will eventually be published in the Dial magazine, which is Emerson's magazine, called Sympathy. And one of the stanzas from this poem says, "So I was taken unawares by this. I quite forgot my homage to confess, yet now am forced to know, though hard it is," which is an interesting line, "I might have loved him had I loved him less." So that is really powerful. And at first people think this is about Ellen, his older sister, who's about 19, and Henry's in his early 20s at this point. Both Henry and his brother John will take her out on chaperoned excursions around Concord, and they both propose to her in 1839. Her father is pretty strict from the South Shore, and he is telling her, his daughter, that she will not be marrying a transcendentalist, either of the Thoreau boys, this kind of thing, that they're from the wrong crew of people. But Ellen this is really interesting because Henry mails her a proposal of marriage. And so it's interesting, Laura Walls, who wrote that biography I was telling you about earlier, writes that in 1839, Henry Thoreau fell in love twice. So we look at these two, And it's a very interesting year for Henry because that's probably the most sort of outward that he's being reaching out to other people. That poem that he had written about her brother, many people take to be about her, but it's all him. It is really actually written about her younger brother. In January of 1842, sadly, John, Henry Thoreau's older brother, cuts his hand sharpening his shaving razor and is soon in the death throes of lockjaw, of tetanus. And the doctor in town should have actually amputated his hand and failed to. And John will die at 27 in the arms of Henry. Henry is absolutely shattered by this. He was the outgoing, fast-talking, first one to propose to Ellen, older brother. They had been school teachers. They had been, school administrators. They had been buddies on their boat trip. And Henry spends a month in psychosomatic symptoms similar to his brother, unable to move and get out of bed. He's that blown away by his brother's death that the family thinks they're going to lose Henry as well, just in that month. 16 days later, the same month, January 1842, Ralph Waldo and his wife, Lydia Emerson, lose their firstborn son, Waldo Jr., to scarlet fever. This is 16 days later. Thoreaus and the Emersons have this devastation at their house. So really tough winter, 1842. By 1843, Ralph Waldo will arrange for Henry to go down to Staten Island and be a tutor to one of his nephews, his brother's son. And Henry's down there for a while. He's kind of shopping some of his writing to New York. Henry says, I've been through New York City. I haven't seen one man in New York City. He says, I've been on the streets up and down New York. I've yet to find one true man in New York City. Henry is not liking it down there. He, in a little bit of humor, and this is one of the first things I'll point out, is that Henry, he tells Waldo Emerson in a letter coming back home that he has been grafting trees, and they're grafting apple trees. They're taking different species and they're taking cuttings. They're actually getting them to grow together. There's a certain way to do it with the buds and things. And Henry says, I've at least grafted buds on a few hundred trees now, seeing what's going to take and what's not. You might even call me a Buddhist Buddhist. So this is Henry's kind of sly, kind of wry humor. Now, many people also credit Henry Thoreau as being the father of the American environmentalism and conservation movement, and there's a lot to this. Henry does publish early on, before we really have any other voice that quite says this, that each town should have a park, or rather a permanent forest, of 500 or 1,000 acres, where a stick should never be cut for fuel, a common possession forever for instruction and recreation. If any owners of these tracts are about to leave the world without natural heirs, they will do so wisely to abandon their possession to all. This is our land trusts that are popular out here in the Western Burbs. So, and of course, you're going to have people like John Muir, Aldo Leopold, Theodore Roosevelt, David Brower at the Sierra Club, lots of people harking back to Henry and kind of pick this up and run with it. Now, what a lot of people are not aware of is that Henry Thoreau and his friend Edward Hoare are responsible for perhaps the largest wildfire in the 19th century that happened in Concord. They were both out fishing, and it was a breezy day, and they stopped on shore with their catch, and they started a fire in a cut tree stump to kind of keep it from being blown out. And quickly the wind took it and just took off with it, and it started an extensive 400 acre fire in Concord. They went running in different directions to get help, but luckily his companion Edward Hoare was the son of the most prominent lawyer in town at the time and a very wealthy man. And so all of the financial ramifications and legal ramifications of this seem to just not exist. It seems like this all happened, and I think the farmers got paid off and this kind of thing, and Henry's not charged with any particular crime. And of course, being the contrarian that Henry is, he will a few days later say, look how green it is. He goes, first of all, fire and the woods go hand in hand, happens all the time. Lightning strikes, they're two parts of the puzzle, they happen all the time. This is not unnatural. And look how green this area that burned now is. And the rest of this forest is not nearly as green or lush. And now this is going to be a rejuvenative, sort of a resetting of the forest. And so Henry takes this completely contrarian position, like, hey, we just did the forest a favor. We're going to get underbrushed if the animals will walk on that kind of thing, berries. So that is him being contrarian again, of course. Now, that's 1843. 1844, the Female Anti-Slavery Society meets, and now they're at the forefront of the abolition movement in Concord, and they're going to be celebrating the anniversary of the freedom of the West Indies, and they're going to invite Frederick Douglass to town. So at what is now the town hall in Concord, Frederick Douglass and Ralph Waldo Emerson speak. Henry Thoreau is sort of master of ceremonies there. This originally was to be set up at the First Parish Church in Concord. And you have to imagine, this is hard to imagine, the church wants nothing to do with any of this controversial abolition stuff. Can you imagine? This is a fundamental human rights issue. And the church is like, nope, that's just a little too hot. We don't want to deal with that. So you're going to have to go over to the public building, the townhouse, in order to do this. Henry had an arrangement with the sexton at the church to ring the bell to announce that there was going to be this meeting. And the way this all comes together, Henry shows up and says, well, I can still ring the bell, right? And the sexton's like, no, the church has nothing to do with this. And Henry's like, pushes him aside and starts ringing the bell. He just starts grabbing the rope himself and starts ringing. And that bell is today featured. This is what this building, this is an 1851 building right in the middle of Concord, the townhouse or town hall today. The bell that Henry rung, part of the First Parish, survived a 1900 fire. Part of the back of it's melted. But it's out here on the front grass of the First Parish, and you can see this right up from August 1, 1844, and that story about Henry. So again, kind of unequivocal and unwavering. Henry's got his eye on what he wants to do, and that's going to be it. By 1844-45, also now we get Henry thinking about getting to Walden, over to some of Ralph Waldo Emerson's land, where he is going to do this experiment. It's going to end up being 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days that Henry builds his own 10 by 15 house. And what he tells us is, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation, unless it was quite necessary. He's not removing himself from society. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, and to drive life into a corner and to reduce it to its lowest terms. And what he also wants to do is he wants to write. And Henry writes in the I didn't pull it out. Did I? I did. Henry writes, for anyone who says, well, Henry was escaping life, he just didn't want to, he wanted to be alone and away from people and this kind of thing. The opening of Walden has this quote that Henry writes in the fourth page here. I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustily as Chanticleer, the rooster, in the morning, standing on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors up. So Henry, as he says, he is not here to practice resignation. He's not quitting life. This is an experiment. This is the reproduction of his house, meticulously redone at Walden Pond by the Visitor Center today. And you look in here, it's all redone exactly as he had it. He had 3 chairs. He said 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, and 3 for society. But that society will grow to be the group of, in 1846, he'll have the Female Anti-Slavery Society actually come and meet at his cabin and have a big gathering there. There'll be at least 30, 40 people there. He says he could cram upwards of 20 to 30 people almost in his cabin if need be. And during the time that Thoreau is at his cabin, he takes a trip to Maine. He does lots of different things. And so he's not self-isolating, saying, I refuse to go back to Main Street, Concord ever again. I want to be out in the woods, this kind of thing. Here's another thing. The woods today are 10 times thicker than they were in his day. In his time, this is a modern map, and here's where the beach is and all this, and so it's sort of at the kind of 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock spot on the entire pond is where you can see the old cabin site. This man named John Roman, who's from the South Shore here in Massachusetts, is this graphic artist who takes into consideration all the historic inputs that he's read specifically about the description of what's going on. Now, the new railroad has just been laid out, the Fitchburg Railroad, and where I'm standing here, the Fitchburg Railroad's coming through right over here. And so it's loud, noisy, and Route 2 is just over the hill here. People are clopping with their horses back and forth. Henry can hear all that. But this is what Walden looked like at this time. If you owned a house in Concord and you needed a woodlot somewhere on the outside of town in order to keep your stoves stoked and for your cooking fuel and all that. And so lots of people had their woodlots out around Walden. It's mostly bare and wide open. Henry's little cabin is there. He's in the bean field there behind him. That was his one crop and his one product that he was putting together as it was his experimentation with economy. And there's his cabin. And it's kind of out exposed. Today, this is all dense woods, just from the last 130, 140 years, this kind of thing. So it would all come back in. So there's another thing. People think, he's way out in the woods, and he's not. Henry's keeping meticulous notes in his calendar with a K, he calls it. And the notes that he has here are the minutia is just incredible. Which flower is blooming? How many birds have flown over today? What the wind and the water, the temperatures, all of this kind of stuff. And these records have been picked through meticulously by Richard Premack at Boston University and by Kristen Case up at University of Maine in Farmington. And they are doing this extraordinary work, making sense of this, first of all, and then piecing together climate data that shows that spring is now 1 week earlier than it was in 1846 and 1847. But I look out and see how much the river has risen. Last night there was a great many portions or islets visible. Now they're engulfed, and it is a smooth expanse of water and icy snow. The water's been steadily deepening on Concord Meadow all night, rising with a dimple about every stem and bush. I mean, that's how meticulous he's looking at how the water's looking as it's actually surrounding the stems and things like that. So we get this whole side of Henry, which is not published until long after his death. This is not a part of what we get out of his published work. Henry does do in 1846 on the ice in the wintertime map of plumbing the depths of Walden, and he is going to become one of Concord's foremost surveyors. While the town of Concord contracts him dozens of times to lay out roads and this kind of thing and map out property in the town of Concord, and Henry is only off by the slightest amount here, and he did this all by hand. And what he points out, which is pretty sweet, is that if the human body, this is, let's see where we are. His cabin was here, the railroad's coming here. We were just looking at that view, looking this way. And if you visit the beach at Walden today, you're down in this end with the visitor center and all that. Henry notes that if the human body were laying like this, the shortest and the longest intersection is here at the heart. And that's where the 102 feet deep is. That's the deepest part of this Kettle Hole Pond. And this is, Henry points that out as, boy, it's remarkable. It's actually right where our heart is the deepest part. 1846, Henry is going to head to town to get his shoes fixed, and the local sheriff arrests him for not having paid his poll tax. Men had to pay $1.50 a year in order to vote, and Henry says that the United States government is acting immorally, and I refuse to even pay Concord because Concord pays Middlesex County. Middlesex County pays the state of Massachusetts. State of Massachusetts pays the federal government of the United States, which is about to invade Mexico. This is a move to expand slavery. We have the Fugitive Slave Act, which is going to get even more intense by 1850, which means that we are all responsible for returning formerly enslaved people to their owners, as opposed to giving them food, shelter, clothing, and a ride to the Fitchburg Railroad to get up to Canada and get out of the United States. We're all federal criminals who assist a formerly enslaved human being that comes up into town. Henry says, "This is immoral. I refuse to play." The sheriff says, "Henry, I'll pay it for you." He says, "Don't you dare pay it for me. Henry, I got to throw you in jail. Throw me in jail." So Henry spends his one night in jail. We have a marker where the jail was located in the center of town, and his aunts will come and bail him out. There's a great story that's not true, but we have a bunch of them in Concord, but it's worth sharing, that Henry is in jail, and Ralph Waldo Emerson eventually visits and says, "What are you doing in there, Henry?" And he says, "What are you doing out there?" Didn't happen. Good story nonetheless. Henry will go on to write Civil Disobedience. Now those aren't his words. His original title was Resistance to Civil Government. This will be published after his death in 1866, and we're pretty certain that publishers aren't keen on the idea of resistance to civil government because we've just had the Civil War. So Civil Disobedience is what this gets shrunken down to. And this is going to be a fundamental text. It's a short little piece that you usually get included with a version of Walden that will influence everybody from Tolstoy to Gandhi to Martin Luther King Jr., who reads it in the Birmingham jail, to the Eastern Bloc countries that are coming out from under the shadow of the Soviet Union, seeking their independence, to the anti-Vietnam War movement. Lots of different movements really take greatly influenced by this particular essay. "I heartily accept the model that government is best which governs least." Now, this isn't "get government out of my way." This is from Henry's perspective that if individuals had their act together, if we all had a high moral principle that we pegged ourselves to, that we actually wouldn't even need that much government. This is not the immediate kind of anarchist anti-government view that you're looking at. Henry is of the full belief that we, the people, are the government, of the people, by the people, for the people. And if we just got our act together, we wouldn't need all this top-down sort of governance, that we'd be fairly independent. Witness the present Mexican War, and it says that the work of comparatively a few individuals using the standing government as their tool, for the outset, the people would have consented to this measure. He's talking about how a small group of people can actually abuse and twist government out of where it should be. So this is all very valid even through today. No question about it. Back at Walden, this is the site of the cabin today. If you visit there, you see these stone posts. That's the old hearth stone where his fireplace was. Henry's going to leave in 1847. And he tells us, "I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one." So he is immediately invited back to the Emerson house, and Ralph Waldo Emerson is going to be on the road lecturing. And interestingly, Henry Thoreau gets to live with Lydia and Emerson. The children are growing up. He gets to be like step husband to Lydia and Emerson for half a year or more at a time. And this is profound. This is a guy who's never paired up with anybody. He's never had any children to raise, and he's immediately in a household fatherly position that he gets to play as a role for a short time and then step back out of. And there is something to Ralph Waldo Emerson being able to travel for 6 months and know that this man is no threat at all to his marriage, right? So when we talk about Henry's sexuality and what Waldo Emerson might know, that kind of thing, I think that this plays into this, that Waldo Emerson knows that he's a very principled person who has nothing to worry about staying with his wife and children. And his wife and children, Lydia and Henry, develop a very close relationship, a loving, deep, loving friendship, brotherly, sisterly, where he writes love letters to her and she's very responsive back and forth and this kind of thing. And I admire in the 1840s here, this is really pushing the status quo of the day. I mean, even today, can you have a loving, deep relationship with someone who's not your spouse? Right? Very threatening. Does not, and non-sexual, non-physical. But could you have a very earnest, a lot of time consuming, lots of conversation, a lot of alone time, all this kind of stuff? We can't handle that. It's not in the mix. It's a very difficult thing. These people are making this stuff work and have enough understanding and self-control and enough sort of principle to actually make this work. And so it's fascinating. The kids love Henry. they write letters to Waldo Emerson saying, "You need to come home because the kids are calling him Pop." That's fascinating. Henry will eventually move back to his parents' house on Main Street with the cats and the piano and the people boarding in the house and his sisters and that kind of thing. This is another shot of the Emerson house, and this is Lydian, Emerson's wife, second wife, and will be very close with Henry. 1849, his book A Week on the Concord and Merrimack comes out, and Emerson has convinced Henry to make a deal to risk getting about 900 copies printed by his publisher and be on the hook for them, and kind of wait for the sales to happen before he pays back the publisher, and only a couple hundred copies actually sell. And so Henry has to take back and pay for the other 700, sadly. And when he returns to his house on Main Street, he snarkily writes in his journal that I have a library of 1,000 volumes, 700 of which I wrote myself. Some of them are unbound and they're highly collectible today. You can kind of find out which ones are which version, this kind of thing, from this time frame to get copies of this. By 1850, we have the Fugitive Slave Act really ratcheted up, and we get a really inflamed Henry Thoreau now, who in the next few years is going to start supporting John Brown. This moral suasion that goes back to the 1830s, it is not working. Slavery is expanding. We have Kansas and Nebraska in the central part, and as we move across North America, it looks like slavery is going to be neck and neck with non-slave states, and that's how the South wants the politics to go and this kind of thing. And Henry comes to the mind that slavery is a bloody atrocity, and it's going to take a bloody atrocity to end slavery. There is no asking nice and voting it out of existence. It's an integral part of the economy. Now, don't forget, in the 1840s here, in these mills opening up and the cotton that's coming up from down south, the whole northern economy is actually benefiting from all that slave cotton from down south too. So there's no north-south split yet. This is really a giant loop of the whole eastern seaboard. And thriving mills from Lawrence and Lowell and all, and even West Concord and all the mills here in this particular town as well. There's a lot going on. And by 1854, Henry speaks on slavery in Massachusetts in Framingham. This is where he is, his hair's on fire. He is so sickened by seeing all the pomp and circumstance of the flag waving and all the fireworks and all the yah-yah, let's celebrate America, while 4 million individuals are enslaved in the country. Henry writes, nowadays men wear a fool's cap and call it a liberty cap. I do not know, but there are some who, if they were tied to a whipping post, what kind of imagery is that, and could get one hand free, they would use it to ring the bells and fire the cannons and celebrate their liberty. So some of my townsmen took to liberty to ring and fire. That was the extent of their freedom. And when the sound of the bells died away, their liberty died away also. When the powder was all expended, their liberty went off with the smoke. Henry's like, you cannot live in a country with 4 million enslaved people and celebrate your liberty. Henry writes, the law will never make men free. It is men who've got to make the law free. Again, we're not subjects like, this is why our country broke from England. We make the law. We are the law. We have to make men free through the laws that we make. They are the lovers of law and order who observe the law when the government breaks it. And so what Henry will be writing in Civil Disobedience is, if there's an immoral law, do you just go and hope to vote against it and get it overturned? Are you a law-abiding person? By God, you will not break any law that gets made. Or are you obliged to break an immoral law? That's Henry's question in Civil Disobedience that Martin Luther King loves. Are you obliged to be civilly disobedient? Because you're going to sit around and wait for this law to finally change, or you take things into your own hands finally. This is our country, not waiting for the government to make their decisions. If it's immoral, where do you stand against the state, with the state? You're a part of the state. What are you going to do? So these are the things that inspired generations after Henry. Walden will come out in 1854, a year after that, and this will do a bit better. And there are some positive and negative reviews of this, but one of the little bits of humor in Walden, Henry writes, as I walked over the long causeway made for the railroad through the meadows, I encountered many a blustering and nipping wind, for nowhere has it freer play, and when the frost had smitten me on one cheek, heathen as I was, I turned to it the other also. That's him playing off the book of Matthew and turn your cheek, this kind of thing. So Henry's humor does not jump off the page, and it is not yuck humor. You have to really kind of read into what his references are. He's usually kind of snarky and sarcastic a bit. And let's see. At Walden, Henry tells us about his own Satori moments. So he also is connecting in the way that Emerson did to nature and feeling that direct connection to God through nature. He writes two different instances happen to Henry that we kind of read into. Sometimes in a summer morning, Henry writes, having taken my accustomed bath, I sat in my sunny doorway from sunrise till noon, wrapped in a reverie, amidst the pines and hickories and sumacs, in undisturbed solitude and stillness, while the birds sang around or flitted noiseless through the house, until by the sun falling in at my west window, or the noise of some traveler's wagon on the distant highway, I was reminded of the lapse of time. So he's losing himself also in the reverie of the connection to nature. He's also hoeing beans, as I was showing you, and he's working on selling beans as part of his small economy from there. And he writes, sometimes when I had finished my hoeing for the day, I joined myself. I love those three words. What does that mean? He had lost himself like Emerson did on the common. It was no longer beans that I hoed, nor I that hoed beans. His spirit and his physicality have separated, and they're coming back. And he says, I joined myself after a day's work, which is just a fascinating sort of self-conception as to how he's feeling and what's going on. So we read into those as very spiritual, recognized moments. All right, so as I said, he does go back. He's going to end up supporting John Brown. John Brown comes to town in 1857 and in 59, collecting money. And the Emersons, a lot of the top people in Concord, even though it's very controversial, donate what is, in today's money, tens of thousands of dollars to John Brown. John Brown first shows up clean cut and respectable looking. He is going to be the messianic Old Testament firebrand, and he'll be bringing rifles and materials out to Kansas, where by 1855, 56, people are killing each other in Kansas over whether or not Kansas is going to be free or slave. The towns are either a pro-slavery, anti-slavery town, and we have the beginnings of the American Civil War happening. People are killing each other many years before the official beginning of the American Revolution. And John Brown feels that we have to get weapons to enslave people. They just have to kill their owners. That's going to be the end of slavery, and we go on from there. There's just no negotiating this. There's no legislating this. And Henry Thoreau now supports this idea. It's like, this is it. There's no moral suasion, as I said earlier from the 1830s. Of course, when John Brown is caught trying to take over the armory down in Maryland, he is summarily hung, and Concord has a service for him in town, very controversial. Most people think John Brown deserved to be hung. He was a maniac, shouldn't have been lauded whatsoever, not martyred. But Thoreau and Emerson and others in the Transcendentalist circle write that John Brown will make the gallows as holy as the cross as soon as he's hung, that he's that much of an important martyr. And they admire him for his just single-mindedness, dedication, principle to what he's doing. Even though it's controversial, they're just stunned by his fortitude and just endless pursuit of the ends, regardless of the means. So Henry gets back now, and it's 1850s. Actually, let me go back to This is the house where Henry's father's pencil business finally gets the family on Main Street. This is solidly middle class, upper middle class. This property just sold for $2 to $3 million a few years ago. Henry dies succumbing to tuberculosis, lying in this parlor behind this window. And he had lived in the attic where all his books were, the 700 books and all that. That was his space up in the attic for quite a while prior to this. But Henry really goes from the pond in Emerson's house back to Main Street. And like I said, the cats and the piano and the people coming and going and all the hubbub and this kind of thing. So like I said, he's not permanently telling us, oh, I'm going to leave society and stay in the woods. And when he's on his deathbed, his aunts ask him, have you made peace with God, Henry? And he says, I didn't know we ever had a quarrel. And there are some, a couple of different people claim to have heard Henry's last words. The sort of coherent thing Henry says is, now comes good sailing, as he's on the edge of death. And but then in sort of a bit of delirium, one of his other friends hears him say, moose, Indian. And Henry had spent time with Native American guides up in the wilds of Maine, and they hunted a moose. And Henry was very taken with this, and he wrote a bunch of stuff about it that we'll find later in his journal that didn't get published during his lifetime. But upon Henry's death, you know, there's still people taking shots at him all the way to 2015. This is from the New Yorker, and I find this is the reason I'm here tonight. It's from the Thoreau Society. Like, we got to get out there because I do tour guiding and Concord. People come from all over the world. Like, oh, Henry was a hypocrite. He went home to have his laundry done while he was at the pond. He wasn't really a survivor. He wasn't really, lost in the woods, all this kind of stuff. He was, yeah, of course he did. There wasn't a man in 1840 who did his laundry anywhere. Okay, they went to war. They had women that went to war with them to do their laundry. There isn't a guy in 1840 who's going to be doing his laundry. Henry's parents live right up the railroad tracks from where he's staying at the pond. He goes back home whenever he wants, comes back with baskets of food from his mom. Hey, have fun at the cabin, There's nothing wrong with this. He never told us he was going to be self-isolating and that all this violates, what he was supposed to be doing and how he's a hypocrite. Thoreau did not live as he described, and no ethical principle is emptier than one that does not apply to its author. The hypocrisy is not that Thoreau aspired to solitude and self-sufficiency, but kept going home for cookies and company. Hey, if Emerson invited him for Sunday dinner at his house, he left the cabin and went to Emerson's house. If Emerson was serving roast beef, the mostly vegetarian Thoreau ate roast beef. Okay, we all contain multitudes and contradict ourselves, as Walt Whitman says. There is no, you can't pigeonhole these people and go, oh, they broke out of their pristine mold that we've cast them in, that's just a gap between aspiration and execution, plus the variability in our needs and moods from one moment to the next. Eminently human experiences, which, had Thoreau engaged with them, would have made for a far more interesting and useful book. I want to ask Catherine Schultz if she actually read this book, because after getting through the economy chapter, which is a bit difficult at the beginning of this, it's pretty mundane, with Henry griping about paying 7 cents for nails when they should have been 4 cents and this kind of thing. You're like, why is he so obsessed with money? It is that we're obsessed with money, and Henry is holding a mirror to us. He's running over all the numbers crazily because we would be running over the numbers crazily. And the whole rest of the book is him telling us about his needs and moods from one moment to the next. Absolutely, this is exactly what he tells us here and what his inspirations are and his connection to nature. The hypocrisy is that Thoreau lived a complicated life. Thoreau did not live a complicated life. I've come here tonight to tell you that. He went back home to live with his sisters and his mom and dad, and he lived as simple a life as he could put together. But he pretended to live a simple one. How complicated was Henry's life? Worse, he preached at others to live as he did not, while berating them for their own compromises and complexities. This isn't quite 100% either. He does call out the materialist culture that he is stepping away from. He's got one foot still on Main Street and the other at the pond. And I would argue that he preached at others who live as he did not to live. He didn't tell you have to do what I'm doing. That's the other thing. He didn't do this to say, what are you doing? How come you're not living in a cabin by the pond? That's not what Henry was doing. Henry was there to write. He's there to mourn his brother. He's there to be with the marginalized people, like the former enslaved people and the people with almost nothing, the Irish railroad workers that are living by Walden Pond, and to get out of the hubbub of Main Street and see if he could not get to the marrow of life, as he say. So this is Catherine Schultz from the New Yorker, and this started this whole ball rolling. Since 2015, these were these people constantly coming. They got this one-liner about Henry Thoreau. Oh, he was a hypocrite. No, he didn't really do what he was supposed to do. He was just going home to, have dinner with his parents, and he didn't, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, so we exhaust ourselves trying to go, wait a minute. There's a much bigger picture here. You can't just simplify it into one sense. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson writes about him after his death. He chose to be rich by making his wants few and supplying them himself. That is not a complicated life. There was somewhat military in his nature, and not to be subdued, always manly and able, but rarely tender, as if he did not feel himself except in opposition. Yes, he was a contrarian, and he loved to take what people thought was, everybody thought one way. Henry loved to take the other position from the other to see really how that would play out. He was a speaker and actor of the truth, born such, and was ever running into dramatic situations from this cause. His night in jail, his leaving his teaching position, absolutely uncompromising, and not going to play, not going to just kind of smooth the corners and acquiesce to social pressures. No truer American existed than Thoreau. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was a man that met Lincoln. I cannot help counting it a fault in him that he had no ambition. Wanting this instead of an engineering for all of America, he was the captain of a huckleberry party. Even his closest local friend, Ralph Waldo Emerson, didn't get Thoreau. Emerson's ambition is not our ambition. It's not money and material and property and this kind of thing. Absolutely, he would rather be the captain of a huckleberry party than of an engineering team. But Henry was still the engineer. He helped his father in the pencil business. He was the surveyor, and a meticulous surveyor. In 1851, he came to Clinton to speak. Henry Thoreau spoke here on New Year's Day, I should say, 1851, and he's going to comment on his trips to Cape Cod, where he's walked all of Cape Cod. And he speaks from where the Russian Icon building was. That was the Lyceum here in the town at the time. And prior to getting here, Mr. Forbes, who's invited him, gets a letter from Mr. Emerson who says, can you please take my friend Henry, he's going to arrive early, and please show him the mills in your town. He's fascinated by the technology. And this is how much of an engineer Henry is. He goes back to his journal and writes, saw at Clinton last night a room of the Gingham Mills, which covers 1 7/8 acres, contains 578 looms, not to speak of spindles, both throttle and mute. The rooms altogether cover 3 acres. They were using between 300 and 400 horsepower and kept the engine at 200 horsepower with a wheel 23 feet in diameter and a band ready to supply deficiencies which have not often occurred. Some portion of the machinery, I think it was where the cotton was broken up, lightened up, and mixed before matted together, revolved 1,800 times in a minute. I first saw the pattern room where the patterns were made by a hand loom. There were 2 styles of warps ready for the woof or filling. The operator must count the threads of the woof, which in the mill is done by the machinery. It was the ancient art of weaving, the shuttle flying back and forth, putting in the filling. As long as the warp is the same, it is but one style so called. That is him taking in, that's an engineer's mind. I don't know if he took notes on that or if he packed that all in his head. I mean, he's down to 578 looms and that. And so even here in Clinton, the review from the Clinton Saturday Courant reports, as one of the committee on lectures of the Bigelow, no, I'm sorry, Thoreau's lecture on an excursion to Cape Cod at Clinton Hall, the lecture before the Bigelow Mechanics Institute at that building last Wednesday evening by Thomas Drew, Esquire, is considered by many as about the best lecture of the course of thus far delivered, totally obscuring even the fine spun threads of Ralph Waldo Emerson and placing Cape Cod, talking about Thoreau, amongst those trifles, light as air, which serve to amuse but not to instruct the listener. So they poo-pooed Henry's Cape Cod talk and said that Mr. Drew even spoke better than Emerson did in his day. So that gives you a little bit about Henry's one stop here. But again, just amazing that everybody misreads Henry, including Ralph Waldo Emerson. There's like, you're graduated from Harvard, you're supposed to be a doctor, a lawyer, a minister, a teacher, right? And this is where Henry is asked later in life by his Harvard classmates to come to a reunion. And there's a little line on the form that says, "What's your profession?" And it's just one little line. You're supposed to have like a 1 or 2 liner. Henry writes, "I am a schoolmaster, a private tutor, a surveyor, a gardener, a farmer, a painter, a house painter, a carpenter, a mason, a day laborer, a pencil maker, a glass paper maker," that's sandpaper, "a writer, and sometimes a poetaster," which is an amateur poet. That's Henry. That's his ambition, is to be this polymath, this multifaceted person. John Updike wrote that Walden aims at conversion. The rest of this book, I highly recommend a reread, but this is true only insofar as we mean conversion of the mystic and personal, not of a religious sort. Henry's gravesite usually has people putting pencils at it up on Author's Ridge at the back of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. "The country knows not yet, or in the least part, how great a son it has lost," by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Henry's he's got a little bit of optimistic cheer to him here. "I have never gotten over my surprise that I should have been born into the most estimable place in all the world, and in the very nick of time, too." This is him seeing this agrarian to industrial world transform. All right, so I recommend, thank you all for coming. I recommend continuing reading Henry. Dig deep, there's a lot to get. And if you keep your eye on Henry, you will start to see new parts of him that you weren't quite expecting. And what I like to do here is based on a little AI that I used on Henry's daguerreotype from Worcester. And perhaps with a little more concentrated effort. Oh, I lost him. We can get to, where do I get this to actually, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this to, anyway, I'm sorry. I usually have them frozen, get them frozen right at the end there with this big smile. I'll try it one more time, see if I can get it to stop it. But thanks for coming tonight. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer all of those. Thank you. Thanks for taking the time to come.